I've heard you express skepticism about the U.S. base in Germany, um, and also related to that, I've heard you talk about Jefferson's and Washington's ideal of no entangling alliances. On the other hand, we have the very real threat of China.
Yes.
So I'm wondering what your position is on the U.S. bases in Japan and South Korea, and then also about the possibility of developing close relations with Vietnam in light of China.
I love starting with some great questions right out of the gate. This is good.
Yeah.
So you're right. You've heard me say that about Germany, but now I've never said that about Japan or South Korea because I think those are actually important. So people who may disagree with some of my views on ending the Ukraine war, they'll wrongfully refer to me as, I mean, the name calling in the media is amazing, but the latest one they'll use is isolationist. No, I'm not isolationist. I look through every conflict through the prism of what advances American interests. So the reason I call out Germany is we have 40,000 of our troops stationed in Germany, where they're a NATO ally, and they don't even spend 2% of their GDP required under NATO on their own national self-defense, precisely because, not because they're stupid, they know because we have 40,000 of our own there. So I say, move those troops to our own southern border and our own northern border too. I will use our military to protect our own homeland. That's how we address the border invasion. And it makes people mad when I call it that, but that's what it is. It is an invasion on our side. Now, conversely, you're right. NATO was created to deter the USSR. The USSR doesn't exist anymore. The real threat we face today is communist China. And I do think we need stronger and more solid relationships with Japan, South Korea, India, Vietnam, Australia, etc., around the Pacific Rim, to be able to ensure, first of all, economic relationships that are able to feed the supply chain that's otherwise tethered to China. We cannot depend on China for our modern way of life. And if there's one president who will actually declare economic independence from communist China while actually helping the economy here, I'm that guy. And I'll tell you why. It's not just onshoring to the US. That's my first best solution. I would love to do that. But I'm not a magician. Can't wave a magic wand and make that happen. That's going to take stronger relationships with each of Japan and South Korea and India and Vietnam. Underappreciated, which you bring up as well.
How about Taiwan?
So Taiwan, great. What's your name, sir? Gerald. So I'm the only candidate, at least as of earlier in this race, that said we would defend Taiwan for the foreseeable future, because Ukraine's not the same as Taiwan. We depend on Taiwan for our entire modern way of life, including the chips in that phone, right? The phone's in your pocket. Probably the refrigerator here that they cool your drinks before they bring it out with. Those are powered by semiconductors that come from that tiny island nation. That's in the American interest. So right now, the U.S. policy is strategic ambiguity. We won't say what we'll do or not. It's called the one China policy that the U.S. embraces today. I think that's actually wrong. It's against our interests. If we say that we will defend Taiwan, and we end the Ukraine war, as I will, on terms that pull Russia apart from China, that's what gives China the self-confidence to go for Taiwan, is that Russia's in their camp. But if we end the Ukraine war on a deal that requires Russia to exit its alliance with China, now China's going to have to think twice before going after Taiwan, and if we say that we will defend, then they won't. That's the answer. And so it's a great way to start with foreign policy, because the foreign policy establishment of the last 25 years has led us into foreign wars that didn't advance the American interest. From Iraq to Afghanistan. For God's sake, the Taliban is still in charge 20 years later in Afghanistan. And Iraq is a more broken country than when we showed up in the first place. So I'm not going to fight the pointless foreign war that doesn't advance our interests. I'm going to protect our own citizens and our own homeland. And for those who don't know it, it probably doesn't come up often on the campaign trail. I think it should. We are more vulnerable now to cyber attacks, super EMP, electromagnetic pulse attacks that could take out our electric grid. That could take out a third of the US population instantly in a matter of months if we take out our electric grid. Missile defenses that we're missing, border defenses that we're missing. The national defense establishment, the national security establishment, has done everything except protecting our own homeland. That's malpractice. That's unacceptable. And I think it's going to take a leader from the outside, somebody who thinks like a CEO, but also understands that my moral duty as your next president is to the citizens of this country, not another one, and that's how I'm going to lead. Great couple of questions to start with. Rowdy, we'll come to you.
Of course, the vast majority of people in the U.S. military are between the ages of 18 and 25. I'm thinking, for example, of a kid right now who's doing gate guard in freezing Fairbanks, Alaska, of another kid who's deep down in an aircraft carrier, keeping that ship running, of another kid who wanted to be a Navy SEAL his whole life, and now he's in Coronado, California, giving it a try. And I wonder if you'd just take a minute just to talk to those young people who are out there on watch all around the world, out on the high seas, who are protecting us, all these kids who are out there protecting us. I wonder if you take a minute to talk to them.
What I will say is this: as your commander-in-chief, here's the number one way I'm going to respect our troops and respect our veterans. God forbid we ever put you in harm's way. It will be to protect the citizens of this country, not another one. $7 trillion of our national debt and thousands of our sons and daughters went to go die in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I will refuse to make those same mistakes again. And the way we stand for our troops is to make sure that our troops and the hard work and the effort and the sacrifices they make actually do make for safer and better lives for the citizens of the United States of America in this country. That's my top job to our veterans and to the people who serve in this country in our active duty military, to make sure that's how we advance our interests. Now, very practically, I think we also need to do a better job of taking care of our veterans. The only presidential candidate that's offered comprehensive veterans policy. Basic things we can do. 6-week decompression buffers. If you come from a combat role before you come back to civilian life, paid 6-week decompression buffers. That brings down the rate of PTSD by 80%. We're not doing it today. Privacy restrictions for veterans who are afraid to report their PTSD because they'd otherwise be tagged with the red flag law. That's unconscionable. Every veteran should have those privacy restrictions. Medical choice for veterans, many of whom, close to 40 per day, are committing suicide in the United States of America. A country that doesn't stand for its veterans is not really a country. Many of them turn into fentanyl and a path to suicide. That ends with medical choice for Schedule I substances to be able to get them as medical care through the VA. Not having to drive 150 miles to the nearest VA center, but to be able to get community-based medical care near where you are. Basic changes we need to make. I've been a CEO. You know who sets the pay of a CEO in a big company? It's the shareholders. Well, I'm going to restructure the VA so that the veterans are treated as the shareholders of the VA. They set the pay of who gets the pay raise and who doesn't at the very top. And one thing I've said, and this is an easy one I'll be able to deliver, and it's the right thing to do, is nobody who is active duty military or a veteran collecting veterans benefits or compensation should have their actual military compensation subject to federal taxation. That will end on my watch as well. And so that's what it means to actually stand for our veterans, not with our words, but with our actions.
If you had the power of the presidency now, what orders would you give to our military leadership?
Well, I think that the first fix is actually at the level of the Pentagon. We have a managerial class at the Pentagon when you have 90% of the people working in the military are good men and women who want to actually be mission aligned and mission focused in advancing the protection of our citizens here, that aren't able to do that because the people in the Pentagon have decided to indoctrinate them with systemic racism and white guilt and white privilege. Actually, there was a study that came out yesterday where a report that said a lot of what Biden actually perpetuated was just made up. The idea, the supposed instances of white rage in the military, many of those were manufactured cases that they used to then indoctrinate the rest of the military with that. So I would clean house at the Pentagon and restore the purpose of the U.S. military: to win wars and, more importantly, to avoid them. Period. That's the goal of our military: to protect our own citizens. So you asked on day one, what would we do? Day one, we would clean house for all of the old top generals at the Pentagon that have veered away from that mission. And yes, I would move our troops to our own southern border and our own northern border too. From places like Germany where they don't need to be. 40,000 of them stationed in Germany, which doesn't even pay the 2% of its GDP that it's required to spend on military expenses. Germany doesn't spend that because they're free riding on the US. That ends on my watch. The 40,000 troops won't use them to protect our own borders, which we're failing to protect in this country. So I think it is a perfectly appropriate use of our own military to protect our own borders. And I get to do that as your next commander-in-chief without asking Congress or anybody else for permission or for forgiveness, and that's why I'm here. Thank you. So I think this is an important divide in our Republican Party. At the start of this campaign, I was the only candidate with a clear position on this to tell you that I did not support sending another $100 billion to Ukraine. I don't support sending another dime to Ukraine because it's unclear what the next $100 billion is going to do that the first $100 billion didn't already. Now we see how our money is being spent so that some kleptocrat in Ukraine can buy a bigger house. That's where it's gone. They haven't been able to account for it. And people here in the United States of America making money off it, off the top of the list is Hunter Biden. The person got a $5 million bribe from the Ukrainian government-affiliated entity. It's no accident that that's the same country that Joe Biden sent in $200 billion of our taxpayer money to. But the ugly part of this is the Republicans are in on the take. Most of them are. So my answer is this. I'm not asking what comes for what advances the interest of another country. I'm asking what advances the interest of the United States. And right now, the biggest threat we face is the Russia-China military alliance. Those two countries are in a military alliance that together outmatches the United States. Russia's nuclear stockpile is ahead of that of the US. Hypersonic missiles travel faster than the speed of sound that can carry nuclear warheads ahead of the United States. China's Navy is arguably bigger than the United States right now. And we depend on China for our modern way of life. Those two countries are in a military alliance with one another. So my secondary issue with the Ukraine war is that we're spending $200 billion of our own money when we're $34 trillion in national debt, and we should be using our own military to actually protect our own borders instead of Ukraine's, which we're failing to do. That's my secondary issue. The main issue I have is that by arming Ukraine to the teeth, we're actually driving Russia further into China's hands, strengthening that Russia-China alliance. So here's what I would do. I would end that war diplomatically with a reasonable deal. I would do it quickly. The terms of the deal are one that Putin would take. We would make a hard commitment that NATO will not admit Ukraine to NATO. And further, we would, yes, have some territorial negotiation where the parts of eastern Ukraine that are occupied, we'd have to reach some reasonable resolution. Keeping in mind, those are Russian-speaking regions. Those are culturally Russian regions. Those are regions that have not participated in Ukrainian elections for the last decade, things you don't hear from the mainstream media. That Ukraine isn't some model democracy, that's a lie. It's one of the most corrupt nations on planet Earth. It hasn't threatened us not to hold elections this year. It's consolidated all of its media into one state TV media arm. It has banned 11 opposition parties. So against that backdrop, yes, we'll do a reasonable deal with territorial concessions in eastern Ukraine combined with a hard commitment that NATO not admit Ukraine to NATO, but not for free. Putin doesn't get that for free. That is in return for Russia exiting its military alliance with China. That's the single greatest way we can reduce the risk of World War III. So what will others say in response to this? They'll say, well, would that embolden Xi Jinping to go after Taiwan? It's the opposite. These people don't deal based on analogy, they deal based on hard power. Right now, Xi Jinping's bet is that the US won't want to go to war with two different allied nuclear superpowers, Russia and China, at the same time. But if Russia's no longer in China's camp, then Xi Jinping is going to have to think twice before going after Taiwan. And I have said that we would defend Taiwan for the foreseeable future. So yes, that's how we would reasonably end the war in Ukraine. Not a single other candidate has offered a clear-headed plan of either how to do this or for what the path to victory actually is. I mean, everybody says give the next $100 billion without any clear idea of how that's actually going to lead anything resembling a victory for Ukraine. Nobody's even defined what victory actually counts as for Ukraine. And a war without a mission is a clear path to Iraq 2.0, which I refuse to oversee and preside over as a passive puppet of a president. $7 trillion of our national debt came from two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that did not advance the American interest. That's $7 trillion of our $34 trillion national debt, with tens of thousands of our own sons and daughters going to die in those wars. So I refuse to repeat those mistakes. This is a deal that Putin would do. This reduces the risk of World War III, and most importantly allows us to focus on using our own national defense spending to actually defend our own homeland in the United States of America. So that's a different vision than the Dick Cheney vision, than the Nikki Haley or John Bolton or Chris Christie, or go down the list of the old Republican Party that I think should be relegated to the dustbins of history. They have not served this country well. And whether that's Joe Biden or our party, I'm against it. The way of the future is putting the interests of our own citizens first. Just as my duty as a father is to my sons and to my family, my duty as your next president is to you, the citizens of this country, not another one. And so that's why my foreign policy is clear. I will keep us out of World War III. I will declare independence from communist China. And then I will use our own national defense spending to defend our own homeland from the invasion that we're incurring right here in the United States of America. And I won't apologize for it.
Are you open to mandatory service like Israelis do, barring some kind of educational commitment or medical limitations? Additionally, the Navy is the greatest Navy in the world, although we are the smallest as of right now. We have about 280 ships versus our greatest threat, which is China, like you had just talked about, over 300. What would you do to grow the U.S. Navy, since we're so vital to the security and prosperity of this nation? And lastly, I just want to say thank you for all you're doing and for speaking the truth.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it. Thank you for your service to this country, man. I appreciate it. I'll address the second piece first. The shipbuilding capacity is actually our biggest bottleneck. And then here's the dirty little secret. It's kind of ugly. We depend on China for almost all of our military production in the U.S. I want you to process how boneheaded that is. I mean, it's bad enough that we depend on China for 95% of our pharmaceuticals. By the same country that, yes, started a man-made pandemic in Wuhan and unleashed hell on the world. That same country is the one, what do you think they're going to do to our legal pharmaceutical supply chain? The one that's lacing the illegal pharmaceuticals coming from Mexico with fentanyl? What the heck do you think they're going to do with our legal pharmaceutical supply chain? So if that wasn't boneheaded enough, turns out our F-35 jets, to much of our naval production and industrial base, depends on China in a way that their military doesn't actually depend on ours. So what the heck do you think they're going to do if we ever end up, God forbid, in a conflict situation? So the first thing is onshoring a lot of that shipbuilding capacity. In the United States, yes, but then you get the purists who say that, and then it doesn't happen, because I'm not a magician. I can't wave a magic wand and make that happen. We have to combine that with also working with our allies in Japan and South Korea and India and Australia and elsewhere, because it's just that urgent. So first best is in the United States and second best is with our allies. We actually can station up even our naval capacity. You'll understand this in Japan. We have ships coming all the way back from the South China Sea to the west coast of the United States, where they should be able to go to our bases in Japan. It doesn't work that way to get refurbished. So that's basic, intelligent changes we can make. And I say this with full respect to you and everybody else who's serving in our military. I think a lot of our managerial class in the Pentagon has completely lost the plot. We're going to clean house at much of that dead weight that's hanging out at the Pentagon. And that leads to the answer to your first question. That's where a lot of the poison's coming from. Part of the reason we have a 25% recruitment deficit is a lot of young people don't want to serve in the military where they're taught to apologize for their skin color. The General Mark Milley's of the world spouting off about white rage or systemic racism. That's not mission aligned to actually protecting this country. And so part of what I want to say is, yes, young people do, it's true, have a crisis of national pride in this country. No doubt about it. 60% of young Americans say they would sooner give up their right to vote than to give up their access to TikTok. That's where we are right now, actually. I mean, I wish, I would be laughing if it weren't true. This is where we are right now, hard fact. And so I've always, for years, I have toyed with this. I've been at the doorstep of the idea of mandatory service, but it's not the American way. In my first book, Woke Inc., if you get to the later part of that book, I struggled with it. And that's why I say I've written 3 books over the last several years. You can see the evolution of my thought here. I think the right way is to, yes, revive some civic duty. So I believe every 12th grader who graduates from high school should have to pass the same civics test that every immigrant has to pass in order to become a voting citizen of this country. You gotta have some skin in the game. And if tests aren't for everybody, then fine. 6 months in a military or first responder role in order to gain your full right to vote in this country. And part of this, of how we do this as young people, also the flip side is they're not stupid. They say, if this is how you're going to treat your veterans on the back end, why the heck would I actually make the sacrifices to serve on the front end? And so that's why I have comprehensive veterans policy. Part of this is to take care of our veterans, of course. But part of this is to stand for what's right in America. Stand for the idea that a country that doesn't take care of its own veterans isn't a country.
You're a Vietnam veteran. You served in the Navy, and you were in Vietnam right at the end of the war in Da Nang in 1972.
1972, first of 1973.
Wow, so right at the end of the
Right
war.
at the end, yes.
Yeah. And you're a supporter of Vivek Ramaswamy?
I am.
And what is it about Vivek that attracts you?
Well, it's his ability to answer the questions and, you know, or in a good way, and you know, he's not the fluff that Donald Trump is. And I like Trump. I voted for Trump. I believe what Trump did was good for the country, but I believe Vivek can take it one step further.
So you were in Vietnam at the very end,
Right.
and I'm assuming that from what you saw, you probably weren't surprised that South Vietnam fell in 1975.
Well, you know, I just no, actually, I'm not surprised, but I just think of the waste of the war and the way it went down. You know, I thought of the American lives that were lost there, and it seemed like for nothing. That's the feeling I had, and I thought, you know, and the way he's talking about keeping us out of war and a fresh light on it, you know. So
that's what I was going to ask. I mean, because you had there were very few Americans in Vietnam in 72 and early 73. I mean, it's
Yeah.
over in early 73.
Yeah.
Very few. You're at the end of it. You can see this didn't work out. This struggle in Vietnam did not work out. And you're saying that one of the things that attracts you to the candidacy of Vivek Ramaswamy is his promise to keep us out of these kinds of wars.
right, especially his opening our eyes to the Democrats and the Republicans that are warmongers, you know, that keep us in that. And we think, we go as veterans, or as anybody, we go to fight for our country when, and in fact, it's for other people's profit. It wasn't for America, it was for other people's profit. You know, and I just think he brought that out to the forefront for me, so.
So I think, for me especially, what was appealing about Vivek is he talked about getting us out of these crazy short-term wars, Afghanistan, Iraq. You know, I served in Bosnia. My wife served in Iraq in 2003 for a year. We have over 1,000 days deployed in combat zones, and I don't want to see that anymore. I mean, we're losing a generation of American men and women to PTSD and the 40 suicides a day, and so he's the only candidate that's really hitting that message hard, and being supportive of veterans after their service. I mean, some of the ideas that he had about a 6-week cooling down period after being deployed, where they could reacclimate themselves back to the civil world. So I appreciate those things, and I think generally speaking, because he loves America, naturally he's going to love the veterans, and that's appealing to me, and I appreciate that from him.
You served in the Army for 26 years.
Yes.
You're a supporter of Vivek Ramaswamy, his
Absolutely.
presidential campaign.
Absolutely.
What is it about Vivek Ramaswamy that leads you to support his candidacy?
Well, he's pro-military and sensible. So his feeling is that we shouldn't deploy the military unless it's really necessary, and that we have problems right here in the country on the southern border and the northern border to a lesser extent, and that's where we should be deploying military until we get that cleaned up, and then we should only deploy overseas unless if it's something that's vital to the security of the United States. So I like that opinion, and I found him to be very supportive of the military and law enforcement, which I'm a retired police officer.
Seems like he wants to empower the military, but not necessarily be in every conflict in the world.